Hello again. Somebody was badgering me on the comments on this channel recently to admit that the British Empire was a racist enterprise. This isn't quite such a simple proposition as it may sound. For one thing, even the word race had a completely different meaning in the 19th century than that which it has now. Somebody else, in another comment, for example, gave what they thought was a clear and unambiguous instance of racism in 19th century science, which was the title of Charles Darwin's revolutionary book. The full title of Darwin's seminal work was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. You see, favoured races. What could be more racist than that? The problem is, of course, that races in that context has absolutely nothing to do with human beings. When Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, he used races simply to mean animals and birds. In other words, race then meant just a breed or a species. This is a good example of the way that a 21st century person can look at something quite innocuous in the past and then immediately misinterpret what they see and wrongly denounce it as racism. And I've seen this happen an awful lot in recent years. Perhaps I'm getting off the subject a little bit. Was the British Empire racist? Before answering that question, we have to ask ourselves something about the nature of empires generally. Like all empires, the purpose of the British Empire was to enrich the important people running the nation which founded the empire. So whether you talk about the British Empire, the Roman Empire, the French Empire, it doesn't matter. The aim is to enrich yourself at the expense of other weaker nations or tribes. Looking specifically now at the industrial nation of Britain in the 19th century, it needed two things. It needed sources of cheap raw materials and also ever-expanding markets for its manufactured goods. So the empire, via the process of colonisation, provided both. It served both those needs. Palm oil, wood, rubber and gold were transported from Africa, and in return the products of factories in Birmingham and Sheffield were taken back to Africa, and the goods were sold to both colonists and natives. Racism didn't really have anything at all to do with this process. It was purely commercial. It's the exploitation of the weak and powerless by the strong, ruthless and unscrupulous. However, nobody wants to admit that there are tyrants and oppressors, least of all respectable Victorians. This is unpalatable, to think that you're simply ripping people off. And so they came up with a good excuse, a reason for the whole enterprise of colonialism and empire, which was that it was being carried out for the benefit of other people. And this is where race enters into the question, not as a cause of empire building, but as a good excuse for doing it. While the British were moving south into Africa and stealing anything that wasn't red hot or nailed down, the Americans were moving west across the Pacific, building an empire of their own, although they didn't call it that, obviously. Neither the Americans nor the British wished to think of themselves as greedy thieves, so they devised a beautiful excuse for their predations. They were really doing it for the benefit of the people whose lands they were plundering. The whole thing, the whole business of colonialism was actually a philanthropic enterprise. By the end of the 19th century, the myth had become established that the British in Africa and the Americans in places like the Philippines were really bringing civilization to savage tribes and primitive people. This is when the expression "the white man's burden" became current. I'm sure we've all heard of that expression, although it's not particularly popular today. Those poor white men in Africa and the white Americans in the Philippines, this was their burden. They were actually trying to work for the advantage of the people whose countries they occupied. Their burden was to spend their lives trying to raise up people that were inferior to them. And this is where race and the idea of inferior races comes in very handy. Kipling, I think I've mentioned before that I'm a very great fan of Rudyard Kipling. He wrote a poem in 1899 on the occasion of the American seizure of the Philippines. It was called "The White Man's Burden." Let me read the first verse to you to give you an idea of the mentality that was being promoted at that time by colonialists. "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." That's quite enough to give a flavour of the thing. Here's a contemporary cartoon which shows Tom Bull and Uncle Sam struggling to carry a lot of black people and foreigners towards a figure labelled civilization. And this cartoon is also called "The White Man's Burden." So in answer to the question, was the British Empire racist? We can probably say that individual white people may well have been, but that the real purpose of the empire was mercantile rather than driven by any ideology, asserting that those whose lands that were being usurped were in some way inferior provided a handy justification for wholesale theft, but it wasn't at all a motivating force behind colonialism and the building of empires at that time.